Yes, I'm making another Given video, and no, I don't care about the YouTube analytics because Given deserves the love and attention of any other amazing anime show that I've watched, and I'm not quite done talking about it yet. And the real question is, will I ever be done talking about Given? No. The answer is probably no, considering the manga's ongoing, and we all know where that's freaking going, so... Given is an outstanding series, and it is particularly impressive for its finely tuned storytelling skills. I want to make a video which highlights the author's use of a specific point of view that makes the following episode much more impactful. And that perspective is Point of View Outsider. If you're not familiar with Point of View Outsider, I'll explain it to you quickly. If you've ever been on AO3 at any point in time in your life, you may have stumbled upon a fic which involves Point of View Outsider, because I think it's a creative way that people in fandoms enjoy expressing perspectives from side characters or background characters that don't get much characterization in the canon series. Point of View Outsider is a perspective from a character outside of the main cast. For example, a story that describes a reclusive family in a small suburban community from a nosy neighbor's perspective who isn't a part of a family, which is the main topic of the story itself, well, that would be Point of View Outsider because it's a person outside of that situation describing their interpretation of events surrounding something separate from themselves. If you ever read a fanfic of a parental figure recounting how their child falls in love or how their child grows up over the years over the course of like an anime series running, and perhaps the child is one of the protagonists of that anime series or like they're one half of a very popular main ship, then that is Point of View Outsider because it diverges from the main point of views seen in the anime show itself. And especially if we don't often see a parent's perspective. And we all know that parents can be sidelined in most animes to just be like vague background support that sort of give short one-liners but aren't really present in the characters' day-to-day lives. In Given's case, the main characters we follow are the band members of Given, but Hiragi provides in episode 8 a point of view outsider perspective as someone outside of this well-rounded cast of characters since we don't know Hiragi as closely as we do the main cast. As a result, he provides a perspective outside the norm that we've seen thus far in the series. Let's break down how Given seamlessly slips into point of view outsider. When Hiragi first appears in this episode, Hiragi stands outside Mafiu's place in the rain. It's a literal point of view outside from Mafiu's, which deliberately sets Hiragi's perspective as a contrast to Mafiu's, where they're separated by the glass of a window and they are a very large distance apart where Hiragi's looking up at Mafiu, so that's already separating them. Then, when we get to the scene at the park and it's raining, Mafiu says, "You've been standing on the sidelines this whole time." Hiragi agrees with Mafiu, and it smoothly cuts to a scene of Hiragi accidentally stumbling upon his two friends kissing in the classroom when he was leaving the school. The story transitions into Hiragi's point of view outsider memory of how he first caught sight of their relationship and never said anything, walking away from the open door. It is a physical representation of him being a bystander and silent watcher of their relationship without outwardly acknowledging them. And then the third person narration trickles in to fully embed ourselves into Hiragi's point of view outsider recollection, and we are whisked away into Hiragi's point of view outsider perspective relayed to us in past tense. Hiragi recalls the past and retells his experience to us, the viewers, who do not know the specifics of how this group of friends all even know each other from their childhood, because till now we literally did not know the context of how they all knew each other. Now that the narration has embedded ourselves into Hiragi's perspective, we get the view from Hiragi's eyes trying to reach the doorbell to Mafiu's house, and this properly transitions us into Hiragi's outsider narration, where he states a paragraph of a narration that I'm not going to go through, but what is important from his narration is at the start of Hiragi's narration, he refers to the collective hour, when he states, "For as long as I can remember, everything happened within that little world of ours." But the last sentence of this paragraph ends on Yuki and Mafiu being separate from their collective group, since he describes them by saying they just gave the impression that they were made for each other. Then it cuts to a shot of Hiragi above the two heads of Mafiu and Yuki from a distance, visually representing the point of view outsider position of someone observing distantly. So both his narration and the visuals reflect Hiragi's outsider position as distant and apart from Yuki and Mafuyu. Hiragi then goes on to describe their personality traits and how they contrast from each other in very short, concise statements that get straight to the point, in which case the author allows Hiragi's narration to read almost like a short story, where Hiragi is just relaying the information concisely and as is in very short sentences that quickly describe each character. And then there is another shot of Hiragi observing from a distance. As the narration states, it seemed as though their little world was complete with their own set of rules. The use of the word complete implies Hiragi and to an extent Shizu, or Shizu-chan, as Hiragi calls them, were not a part of this tiny orbiting world. It was only for the two of them, not for Hiragi and Shizu-sumi. We get Hiragi's point of view of their fight, which is like the ending off sequence of Hiragi's recollection of the past. And he's once again in the distance, watching the fight progress. He has the objective perspective to describe the fight as a stupid little fight, pointless, and the kind of silly scuffle everyone's had before, relating to the audience that at the time, he probably thought nothing of the fight, or that anything bad would happen to Yuki afterwards. The only indication we have is Hiragi's clear worry and noticing that Mafuyu is the one now separated and distant from all of them. He is alone, very much angry and sad, but there isn't anyone with him to talk about it. And they all leave Mafuyu at the train station. And that is usually like the shot that breaks me up the most whenever I rewatch this episode, of how Hiragi just, once again, is a bystander in the point of view outsider position, but mainly the bystander, where he's just watching and sees clearly that Mafuyu is upset, sad, and very much alone, but they still move on and walk away anyways. I don't know, that shot just gets me each time. Mafuyu in the present extends a metaphorical olive branch between them by telling Hiragi about their upcoming lives, so that Hiragi can come see him play, and it invites Shizu as well. The narration as Hiragi leaves wraps up his point of view outsider perspective in a perfectly tied bow by repeating the earlier statement, but amending it with the comment, but more than anything else, he wants Mafuyu to forgive him. So it perfectly ties up Hiragi's point of view outsider perspective. Before, it just stated he wanted to be forgiven, but truly the specific factor that was omitted in the narrator was the fact that truly he just wants Mafuyu to forgive him, especially more than anyone else, as the narrator describes. And then after this scene, we cut back to Mafuyu and we gain Mafuyu's personal perspective finally, and it adds a heart-wrenching detail to how he first met Yuki. The personal and close point of view provides a beautiful contrast to Hiragi's more objective perspective and makes this personal flashback far more meaningful, because the vague details of why Mafuyu and Yuki became close and stuck together to support one another is expanded upon with the knowledge of Mafuyu's trauma and how that connected him and Yuki on a deeper level than what we initially thought when we were given Hiragi's outsider perspective. With this context, it gut-wrenchingly hits the audience how important Yuki was to Mafuyu. And without that point of view outsider perspective before, I don't think this scene would hit as hard, because it truly provides an extreme contrast between a very objective, sort of distant perspective from Hiragi, where he describes things in hindsight, to Mafuyu's more personal, very brief recalled memory that he just immediately thinks of because he's in a park, and it reminds him of how he probably first met Yuki, like near a park. The contrast between the perspectives allows Mafuyu's more personal perspective to hit us that much harder. So in short, the scenes are in as follows. 1. We get a setup of Hiragi's outsider perspective. 2. We are given Hiragi's point of view outsider perspective through a recalled memory of Hiragi. 3. Mafuyu and Hiragi take the first step to resolving their distant friendship through Mafuyu's invite. And 4. We get a smooth cut to Mafuyu's personal flashback from a protagonist's first-person perspective. The key to Given's incorporation of Hiragi's perspective is how the scenes frame Hiragi's view. If you've noticed, as I went over each scene, Hiragi is often displayed distant and separate from others in each scene. And if he's with someone, it's usually beside Shizu, who is included in Hiragi's mind as another person who was a bystander or outsider to Yuki and Mafuyu's relationship. And even if you could argue, oh, he's still beside someone, the point still stands that Matthew and Yuki were on a whole other plane of existence than anyone else. They were completely in one another's orbit and not included in wherever Shizu, Hiragi, or literally anyone else within their social circle were. So why do I love this perspective so much to make a whole video on it? I love Point of View Outsider so much because we are gaining a description of a relationship from a person outside of it. And I don't think Point of View Outsider is commonly shown in anime unless it's from a third party who is interested romantically in one of the two characters. But this is a perspective from a friend, not a person interested romantically in either character. And it's refreshing to see because the descriptions read like a novel or a short story. The descriptions of these two characters are short and concise, but convey their contrasting personalities very well. It answers the question of how did everyone else see Yuki and Matthew's relationship? What was being around them while they were in love like? And it occupies a perspective similar to our own as anime watchers, or if you read the manga first, as a manga reader, we ourselves are outside of a relationship. So whether we're an anime watcher or a manga reader is a perspective that is more closely related to us since we are also outsiders from this fictional relationship. There could be other examples of a point of view outsider trope in anime, but having a whole dedicated section and flashback to a point of view outsider rather than a stray internal thought revealed, I think isn't a very commonly used storytelling aspect in the anime I personally watch. And even if there were a point of view outsider perspective, I feel like it's very rare for it to be structured so well as it is in episode 8 of Given. As I said before when I broke down the structure, it is structured so perfectly that it makes watching the episode so much more satisfying. Like, it's such a satisfying episode to watch. Even if there are a point of view outsider perspectives in other animes, I do think Given is probably the cream of the crop in terms of the execution of point of view outsider. I feel like if this were another anime, they would have done a more personalized flashback to introduce Yuki as a well-rounded character, rather than the vague understanding we get from our guesses from how Matthew and Hiragi speak of him during their previous conversations before episode 8 and during episode 8. In another anime, they might have given us a super personalized flashback from Matthew's perspective in a more first-person perspective similar to what we get after Matthew performs the song during the end credits. But instead, the author chooses to hold back on that personal perspective until after he performs the song, for one. And secondly, the author chooses to introduce Yuki and to an extent Yuki and Matthew's relationship to us from Hiragi's distant perspective. And what is important is that we gain a perspective from someone else not in the relationship. Now, it won't be a completely unbiased perspective because he's friends with both of these characters. So it's not going to be completely unbiased because he's a friend. He's going to be slightly biased. So it's not completely objective, but introducing Yuki through a whole other character that isn't Matthew provides a fresh perspective that feels a lot more slightly objective, like not completely objective. It feels a lot more objective and realistic in comparison to Matthew's perspective, who might have known Yuki in a different way than Hiragi knew Yuki. And perhaps because Matthew was so in love with Yuki, if we had been given a first-person point of view flashback from just Matthew instead of Hiragi, we wouldn't have been able to see more of their flaws and imperfections, like Hiragi is able to pinpoint as a longtime friend of both Yuki and Matthew. As people say, people in love could often be blinded by their love and not see the more objective picture of a relationship, which is why I really appreciate Hiragi's outsider perspective. Hiragi's way of describing, oh, it was like a silly little scuffle, sort of played off the significance of what the fight was about, because at the time he probably thought nothing of it. But through Hiragi's point of view perspectives, we could see the slight flaws, whether it's Yuki's character or Matthew's character to an extent. To an extent, even both of them, from the fact that they were so caught up in each other and perhaps maybe depended on each other so much that it was an unhealthy dependence on one another, one could argue. Though I don't think I could completely argue it was an unhealthy relationship due to the fact that they seemed to love each other so much and they seemed happy in their relationship. But you could argue from a way Hiragi is describing them as like how they weren't complete without one another, that sort of perspective of feeling incomplete by yourself itself could be sort of toxic if we're thinking in terms of like modern times. You don't have to have a person to feel like complete in your life. Obviously, this is a romanticized version of love that Hiragi's talking about, like where he's perhaps a bit envious of how perfectly Yuki and Mafuyu seem to complete each other on the surface. Like they were the picture perfect romantic relationship he saw, even though he didn't acknowledge it, or he didn't verbally acknowledge it, or like tell them that he knew about the relationship. In his mind, he saw them as, you know, meant for one another and perfect for one another. But in reality, there were cracks in their relationship. Yuki wasn't spending enough time with Mafuyu. He wasn't prioritizing how Mafuyu was emotionally feeling, or taking into consideration like what was going on with him. And then also later on, we find out that Mafuyu was waiting for Yuki to ask him to join in the music aspect of his life. Like he wanted Yuki to say, let's do this together, rather than doing things apart, or like Yuki pursuing music purely on his own. Like he didn't reach out his hand and say, let's do this together. He was just working separately with Shizu and Hiragi only, and not including Mafuyu. So it was these intricacies that Hiragi is hinting at through this flashback. We see hints of the fact that Mafuyu and Yuki became distant, and we see the shot of Mafuyu being alone from Hiragi's outsider perspective at the end after their fight. Perhaps even a visual metaphor. Mafuyu just wanted Yuki to, you know, reach out his hand and be like, let's do music together. But he didn't. They were still separate. They didn't reconcile or mend the bridge. They separated and tried to cool off, but that just didn't work out as well due to the terrible circumstances of what occurred that night with Yuki. Even though obviously Mafuyu probably wanted to patch things up because he visited him, but it was already too late. What I can gather is the most greatest pro out of a point of view outsider perspective is that as an audience, we begin to occupy a perspective that is more close to us, the viewers, because we ourselves weren't a part of the relationship, just like Hiragi wasn't. And so it feels as if we, along with Hiragi, are witnessing a relationship bloom from an outsider perspective. And one can argue as a viewer, you might view these characters as friends you would care about and want to excel, do well, or ace a performance and get the guy they're falling for. Like we all feel these emotions as viewers, as if we're a friend cheering them on. So to occupy the perspective of a person watching that is a friend, I think it's a lot easier of a transition that doesn't feel jarring or awkward, but smooth and a breath of fresh air from the very close first-person perspectives we are constantly bombarded with, such as Uenoyama's internal ramblings, or Mafuyu's practically half-whispered confessions of lacking the ability to express himself properly. I feel like Hiragi's point of view outsider perspective is very much a breath of fresh air from those extremely close first-person perspectives we're constantly used to throughout the show. It kind of just lets you sit back and sort of watch things from a distance for once, rather than so closely where we're in the character's head so deeply, like in previous episodes. As an audience, this outsider perspective also gives us further understanding of Yuki's character. And I think the reason episode 9 hit so hard for us is because of the build-up Hiragi's perspective provides. He gives us a taste of Yuki's personality and who he is, but we don't get the full picture because the perspective is still a limited one of a person who is only Yuki's friend. We only get the more personalized perspective once Hiragi leaves Mafuyu, and Mafuyu recalls how he first met Yuki. And episode 9 expands on Yuki even further. This episode provides the road work for that expansion, so that episode 9 becomes that much more impactful for the audience. Before this episode, we don't really know Yuki at all. We know of him. We know that he was someone important to Mafuyu, that they were lovers, and that Yuki died from tragic circumstance. But we don't really know Yuki as a well-rounded character. We as viewers are similar to Uenoyama in that we just know vaguely about him. We know his name and his emotional importance to Mafuyu due to the fact he cannot even express how sad he feels through any words, and that expressing himself is something he struggles with. But besides the vague mention of him, we don't really get any personal knowledge of him. Hiragi opens the door to knowing Yuki, and thus allows us to become that much more enraptured in Mafuyu's story. And now that we know more about Yuki, we also have become attached to him, so that his loss of life feels hard on us as well. We're like Mafuyu, we feel like we've lost something very beautiful. A person who is very charming and wraps you up in his world is now gone from this world, and Mafuyu is now in this world but doesn't have Yuki in it anymore, and he's struggling to make sense of this altered world where a person he was used to being there is no longer around. Even if he's experiencing a new love, the fact that Yuki was an important person in his life and is no longer in this world, and he can't really talk to him about anything that's happening in his life currently and how much he's loving music, the new experiences he's having with music, and how his passion is just keeps growing and growing, it makes the loss feel that much greater to us as viewers. And by giving us a greater understanding of Yuki's character through Hiragi's perspective as his friend. And because of his greater understanding, that loss is so much more impactful and heart-wrenching to us as viewers. And I still am probably not going to be over it. No matter how many times I watch this show, it still emotionally moves you, especially if you hear A Winter Story, the song. You're going to get emotional. Finally, with Hiragi's point of view outsider perspective, we can also view how Matthew has changed over time, and the contrast between Yuki and Matthew's dynamic versus Uenoyama and Matthew's dynamic. Hiragi previously described Matthew as docile and quiet, and it could just be a mistranslation in terms of like Japanese to English. Perhaps docile isn't the correct English word to completely articulate what the author in the manga was trying to say, but that was the subtitle I was given when I watched this show. So that is the one that I'm sticking with. So Hiragi previously described him as docile and quiet. Like that was the description we were given in terms of the anime watchers. But as the show goes on, we know as viewers, he's quite witty, frank, and does not hold back when it comes to talking shit about Hiragi to his face. He also isn't quite what I would describe as docile towards Uenoyama. I'm putting docile in quotation marks. Like I'm putting up the bunny fingers because docile does not, I do not think, in terms of wording, describe how Matthew, like, acts with Uenoyama. Like, to me, he doesn't, like, maybe at the start of a show, by episode 8, I didn't think Matthew was a docile person. Yes, quiet and introverted, like, that obviously describes Matthew, but just because a character is quiet and introverted, I feel like describing him as docile might have been more accurate for Hiragi at that time when they were in, you know, middle school, and perhaps when Matthew was even younger, like, when they were, like, tiny little gremlin children. Maybe he was a lot more docile. But as of now, as a high schooler, to me, Matthew, I feel like, has grown as a person. Like, I don't think he could be described as docile anymore. He's often the one who is more active in the relationship with Uenoyama, offering to hold hands, and, you know, like, he says he'll be the one to protect Uenoyama when he offers to hold his hand scene, and he was the one who confessed to Uenoyama first, so he's often the more active party in this relationship. So I know in the OVA, I'm pretty sure, like, Uenoyama is probably a bit more active sometimes, but usually Uenoyama is always a constant state of gay panicking. So he's a lot more flustered and like a little bit fumbling, and for once I feel like Matthew is the calmer one and the one who's taking the lead of things because he has more experience than Uenoyama, who's like doesn't have much relationship experience as Matthew does. But what I'm saying is I feel like this perspective that Hiragi provides, how he describes Matthew, also relates to us, the viewer, how Matthew has partially changed. Like we see the character grow from this recounted memory that Hiragi provides. All in all, I think Point of View Outsider is an underrated writing technique. I've just seen more shows that I watch so you could get to know what exactly a side character's thoughts are on another aspect within the narrative. In Hiragi's case, we gained insight on how he viewed Matthew and Yuki not only as his friends, but their relationship with one another from the start of their friendship all the way to Yuki's fight with Matthew at the station. Other than that, I don't have any more to say about Point of View Outsider because it's just a very underrated perspective I don't think many animes use. I just wanted to make an excuse to make a video where I get to gush about how great Point of View Outsider is in many forms of media, and I would love to see it not only in like the stories I read, but also in the anime I watch, because I feel like it's a very fun perspective to see that changes up the narrative in a very interesting way that I wish we could see more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you all. What did you guys think when you first watched episode 8? Other than that, thanks for sticking around for these videos and dealing with the large breaks between them, and I'll see you all in my next one.